Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here at Heavenward Thinking. Today, we're continuing on with the story of Abraham, and we're in Genesis chapter 13. So I'll read it and we'll get right into our topic today. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent, and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So we see in this chapter, we're continuing on with the story of Abraham, and we see a little bit of conflict between Abraham and Lot's herdsmen in this chapter, and we see that they have to split. And once again, we go back to the last chapter and see that God was making this promise to Abraham, and he told him to leave his country and go where God was showing him. God did not say that he was going to make the blessing come through all of Abraham's relatives and family, and that they were supposed to do this all as a clan. He specifically said that it was going to be Abraham and his offspring. So we see in this chapter that God allows something to happen for whatever reason that separates Abraham and Lot, and we focus in a little bit more on Abraham and his calling and the promise of God. Once again, at the end of the chapter, we see God reaffirming that promise, now for the third time in these two chapters. So we see several different things here. We see the separation and how that was done, and it is interesting to look and see the different characteristics of the characters in this story, and how Lot was presented by Abraham, which part of the land he wanted to choose, the right or the left, and he chose what looked beautiful and great and green, and was going to be great to settle in and would be the best of the land. And we see that Abraham then was left with what would have been maybe considered lesser. But we see that God reaffirms his promise to Abraham, and we see on the flip side of that Lot was going somewhere that was going to be ultimately destroyed. We see that it even says here, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It gives you a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's going to come in the next chapters, and we're going to see that Lot gets into a lot of trouble. And he's going to have some significant difficulties that Abraham's going to have to go try to rescue him out of, and that God's going to have to intervene miraculously to save him from the destruction and the wrath that came out against Sodom and Gomorrah. So we see that selfishness of Lot did not pay off in the end. It caused a lot of problems, and Abraham's willingness to allow Lot to choose the better portion of the land, or the land that he preferred, it didn't result in anything less. Instead, he was blessed by God, and God told him that he was going to get all the land that he saw, and that God was going to give it to his offspring forever, and that he would make his offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted, showing that God was going to multiply his descendants more numerous than anything you could imagine. And we're going to see that again when the promise is later reiterated again about more numerous would Abraham's descendants be than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. We see that God is doing something miraculous, and he's taking one man, and out of that one man making a great nation for himself. the Israelites, who are going to be so important throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and making the way for Jesus, who would ultimately come and redeem all of mankind. And once again, we talk about that blessing that we talked about in chapter 12 was for all the world to be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. Not just the Israelites, but all the world would be blessed. And we see that in the person of Jesus Christ and in the salvation that only comes through Jesus for all of mankind, Jews and Gentiles. And we see how important it is when we look at these chapters. God is setting up a nation. He's setting up his plan of salvation that's going to come through this nation, and the whole storyline and plan of salvation, which is found all throughout Scripture. We saw it when we started at the beginning of Genesis in chapter 3. We saw it from the very beginning when we fell and we sinned. God was already setting up his plan of salvation. We see that continuing when we see the flood account, and we saw how Noah was set apart from his generation. God called him. He did everything that God commanded him to do, and God saved him through the ark, and out of him came all these generations that we went through. And we have the story of the Tower of Babel, where mankind was dispersed throughout the world and our languages were confused because man was not doing what God wanted them to do. And then here we are in Genesis chapter 12 and 13, where we start to see God choosing a nation, making a nation, preparing a nation through Abraham. And we see that story start to continue here in Genesis chapter 13, where we have this account. It's a long account for maybe a simple detail, we think, but it's important to see the character here of Abraham and how he was willing to let Lot get the better choice. And out of that, God still blessed him and continued to reaffirm his promise. No matter what things looked like, God was going to do something miraculous. And it foreshadows what God's going to do through Abraham, how he is going to give him a son, which would not have been possible at the age of Abraham when he has a child. And we see that God is always working on impossible things and making them possible. So when we look at this in a modern day setting, we should be able to see different things. First, we should not be selfish. We should be selfless, as the New Testament shows us, as well as this Old Testament passage. We need to make sure that we are not being selfish in life, because selfishness leads us to being in the wrong places at the wrong times, just as Lot ended up being in the wrong place and the wrong time, and he had consequences that he had to suffer through and struggle through and face the wrath that came against Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we need to make sure that we are in the right place, the right time, with the right motive, selflessness, looking at others' interests ahead of our own. Another thing that we can take out of this is, again, the faithfulness of God. He constantly is reaffirming his promises to us. He's constantly reminding us of his faithfulness, how he is going to do something, how he is going to do something miraculous, not based on our merits, but based on his. In this chapter, God doesn't say that Abraham is this amazing guy and that God wants to bless him because he is an incredible godly man. No, instead, God is just telling him he's going to do something. He's going to do this, and it doesn't mean that Abraham has to do all these things. No, God's just doing something on his own, choosing to use Abraham. He didn't have to. He didn't need Abraham. God chose to use Abraham, and he's going to do the same for you and I. God doesn't need us to accomplish his purposes, but he wants to include us in his plan. He wants us to be saved, to get into a relationship with him, and to continually be in relationship with him, digging into his word, praying, seeking after him, reaching other people with the good news of the gospel. Those are the things we should be doing, remembering the faithfulness of God all the time. He's always going to be faithful to us, and he's going to do great and mighty things. And even when it looks like we get the second best land, just like Abraham here, God is faithful to do amazing things and to use whatever situation we're facing, and he is going to do great things through that, even when things look dark in our own lives. Some of us are in tough places throughout life. Maybe things aren't great. We look around the world right now, and there's a lot of darkness going on with the pandemic, with lots of unrest and questioning and people being in doubt a lot. We see here in this chapter that God is faithful, and God makes ways through things that we don't always see ourselves. So we should be encouraged in our own lives to trust in the faithfulness of God, to see stories like this, stories about Abraham, and see how God is working through them, how it was a process, and how for us it also will be a process. We shouldn't be shocked when things don't happen right away, when things take many, many years to happen. just as it is happening throughout the story of Abraham. We need to look at that, see that it wasn't an instantaneous fulfillment of God's promise. Instead, it was a process, and we see each and every detail we're going to look at of this promise. And in our own lives, we can look and see that God is making a way for us to do. He has a plan for us, a purpose for us, but it may take time and it may require a long process, maybe longer than we would like. So just trust in God's promise and his faithfulness this week. And join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here at Heavenward Thinking.